Imagine climbing into an aircraft so badly designed that it looks like it was built by a committee of drunk inventors and desperate generals. Aviation history is full of brilliance, but it's also littered with flying saucers that couldn't fly, nuclear planes that terrified their own crews, and prototypes that were more effective at taking out test pilots than enemies. Today, we're taking to the skies, briefly and often disastrously, to look at 10 aircraft that should never have made it off the drawing board. Strap yourself in, because this ride is going to be short, bumpy, and occasionally on fire. And while we're up in the air, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tenfold Gold. That way you'll never miss more incredible stories of human genius and, in this case, human lunacy. Number 1. The Spruce Goose, Hughes H-4 Hercules. Howard Hughes had money, vision, and an ego big enough to fill the sky. During the Second World War, he decided America needed a giant flying boat that could carry troops and tanks across the Atlantic without risking U-boats. The result was the H-4 Hercules, later nicknamed the Spruce Goose, though it was mostly made of birch. At nearly 220 feet across, it was the largest wingspan aircraft ever built. It was also absurdly heavy, staggeringly expensive, and years late. By the time Hughes finally rolled it out in 1947, the war was long over and the military had lost interest. But Hughes wasn't about to let his vanity project die quietly. In front of a crowd of skeptics, he took it for a test flight. The Spruce Goose lifted off for a grand total of about 30 seconds, reaching an altitude of 70 feet before gliding back down. That was it. The plane never flew again. Hughes insisted it wasn't a failure, just resting. But in reality, it was a flying white elephant. Today, it's parked in a museum, an enormous wooden reminder that money and ambition don't always equal aerodynamics. 2. The Flying Pancake, Vought V173 XF5U. Only in wartime desperation could someone look at a flat circular wing design and say, "Yes, let's serve this up to the Navy." The Flying Pancake was Vaught's attempt in the 1940s to build a fighter that could take off in ridiculously short distances, even from tiny carriers. Instead of a traditional fuselage, it looked like a UFO made of pressed steel, with propellers bolted on either side to try and haul it into the air. To be fair, the Pancake did technically fly. Test pilots reported it could handle surprisingly well once you got over the feeling you were piloting a kitchen utensil. But the real problem was the engines. They were underpowered, constantly overheating, and the aircraft's complicated transmission system was a maintenance nightmare. By the time engineers got around to thinking about how to fix it, jet fighters had already arrived on the scene. Suddenly, a flat propeller-driven saucer looked about as modern as a horse and cart. The Navy canceled the project in 1947, scrapping the only prototypes. All that's left are a few grainy photos of this flapjack of the skies, a design so daft that even its name sounds like a breakfast order gone wrong. Number 3. The Christmas Bullet. If there were a prize for the deadliest holiday-themed invention, the Christmas Bullet would take it. Designed in 1919 by Dr. William Christmas, a man with more confidence than engineering skill, it was a single-seat biplane that he swore would revolutionize aviation. His boldest claim? That the wings didn't need bracing struts or wires because they were flexible and would flap gracefully like a bird's. Spoiler, they didn't. The first prototype barely got off the ground before the wings snapped clean off, ending the life of the test pilot instantly. Undeterred, Christmas built another one. The exact same thing happened: takeoff, wing failure, fiery crash. By this point, even the US military, who had briefly entertained the idea of buying it, wanted nothing to do with him. Astonishingly, Christmas still declared his design a success, insisting the crashes were down to pilot error. The Bullet never flew again, but its legacy lives on in aviation history as one of the worst ideas ever bolted together. A wooden death trap built on delusion, it proved that sometimes the only thing airborne is the designer's ego. Number 4. The Bartini BVA14. If the Cold War was a competition to build the strangest flying contraption possible, the Soviets would have walked away with the trophy. Enter the Bartini BVA14, dreamed up in the 1970s by Italian-born designer Robert Bartini. It was meant to be an amphibious aircraft that could also skim over the sea like an ekranoplan, hunting American submarines with devastating efficiency. On paper, it was part jet, part seaplane, part flying boat, and part Bond villain gadget. In reality, it was a nightmare. The engines never worked as intended, and it was so heavy it could barely get off the ground. To make matters worse, the special lift jets that were supposed to let it glide over the water's surface were never actually installed, so it was basically a lumbering jet with inflatable pontoons. Its only successful flights were lumbering takeoffs that looked more like a drunk walrus trying to belly flop into the sea. When Bartini died in 1974, the project lost its only real champion. The VVA-14 was eventually abandoned, left to rust away in a Russian scrapyard. Today, its remains look less like a superweapon and more like a tragic monument to Soviet overambition and under-delivery. Number 5. The Cullinin K7. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union decided bigger definitely meant better. Enter the Cullinin K7, a flying fortress so massive it looked like an apartment block sprouted wings. With a wingspan of over 170 feet, twin booms for the tail, and no fewer than 7 engines strapped across its enormous wings, it was supposed to be the pride of Soviet aviation. Some versions of the plan even included gun turrets, bombs, and space for over 100 passengers. What could possibly go wrong? Pretty much everything. Its sheer size made it a nightmare to control. Vibrations shook the whole frame like a cheap washing machine, and takeoffs were an exercise in terror. On one of its test flights in 1933, a structural failure caused the tail booms to collapse mid-air. The aircraft smashed into the ground, wiping out most of the crew and passengers. After that disaster, the dream of turning it into a fleet of Soviet mega-bombers died almost instantly. The K-7 remains one of the largest planes ever built, but also one of the shortest-lived. It stands as proof that you can't just scale up an idea until it looks like a flying block of flats and expect it to work. Number 6. The Avrocar, Avro Canada VZ9. In the 1950s, the world was obsessed with UFOs. While the public stared at the skies looking for aliens, the US military thought, why don't we just build one ourselves? Enter the Avrocar, a Canadian-made flying saucer-shaped aircraft secretly funded by the Americans. The idea was to create a vertical takeoff vehicle that could hover, fly, and generally look like something straight out of a pulp magazine. The reality was less close encounters and more hovering lawnmower. The Avrocar barely got a few feet off the ground before wobbling around uncontrollably. Pilots described the experience as trying to balance on a beach ball while someone kicked it from underneath. It overheated, made a deafening racket, and had the aerodynamic grace of a dustbin lid in a gale. Every attempt to push it higher than a hover ended in disaster. After years of wasted money and mounting embarrassment, the Avrocar project was scrapped in 1961. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, both now museum pieces. It turns out that just because something looks futuristic, it doesn't mean it will actually fly any better than a dropped frying pan. Number 7. The Macdonald XF-85 Goblin. Picture this. It's the late 1940s, and the US Air Force decides its shiny new long-range bombers need tiny fighter escorts. But instead of just giving them something practical, they cooked up the idea of a parasite fighter that could be carried inside the bomber's belly, then dropped out mid-flight like a wasp from a hive. Thus, the Macdonald XF-85 Goblin was born. A stubby, egg-shaped jet with no landing gear, designed to hook back into the mothership when the mission was done. In theory, it was ingenious. In practice, it was a disaster. Docking back with the bomber was next to impossible. Test pilots likened it to trying to thread a needle during an earthquake while being shot at. More than once, the Goblin smashed into its host plane, forcing emergency landings in open fields. And without landing gear, emergency landing meant skidding across the dirt on its belly like a stranded fish. After a handful of humiliating tests, the project was canned. The Goblin never saw combat, never escorted a bomber, and never lived up to its cartoonish name. Today, it's remembered as the world's most impractical attempt at turning bombers into aircraft carriers. Number 8. The Convair NB-36H nuclear test plane. In the 1950s, the US was drunk on atomic optimism. If you could dream it, someone somewhere tried to power it with a nuclear reactor. Cars, trains, even lawnmowers were floated in theory. But the most terrifying experiment of all was the Convair NB-36H, a modified bomber with a working nuclear reactor bolted inside its fuselage. The plan was simple but insane. Build a bomber that could fly forever without refueling, circling the globe with endless nuclear endurance. Of course, there were a few tiny problems, like what happens if the plane crashes and spreads radioactive fallout across half the continent, or how to shield the crew from being fried alive by their own power source. The NB-36H did fly, 47 test flights in fact, but the reactor was never actually connected to the engines. It was more of a grotesque science fair project, proving they could carry a nuclear reactor in the air, even if they had no idea how to use it safely. By the early 1960s, sanity prevailed. The program was shut down, and the dream of nuclear-powered aircraft quietly buried. The NB-36H remains a chilling reminder that wherever possible, the words nuclear and airborne should never share the same sentence. Number 9. The Stipa-Caproni flying barrel. In 1932, Italian engineer Luigi Stipa had what he thought was a stroke of genius. Instead of a sleek fuselage, he designed an aircraft that was basically a giant hollow tube with wings stuck to the sides. Officially called the Stipa-Caproni, but forever remembered as the flying barrel, it looked less like a machine of the future and more like someone had lobbed a sewer pipe into the sky. The idea wasn't entirely nonsense. Stipa believed his barrel-shaped fuselage would act as a giant duct, improving engine efficiency. And to be fair, the plane did manage to fly. The problem was it flew like a sedated pigeon. It was slow, clumsy, and so drag-heavy that test pilots described it as trying to shove a wardrobe through the air. Even in an era full of experimental designs, nobody wanted to take it further. Despite being a failure, the flying barrel is often cited as an ancestor of jet propulsion theory. But history remembers it less as a stepping stone and more as a comic misstep, a flying drainpipe that proved not every bright idea should leave the drawing board. 10. The Curtiss-Wright XP-55 Ascender. By the early 1940s, American designers were keen to push boundaries. Enter the Curtiss-Wright XP-55 Ascender, a pusher-prop fighter with its engine at the back, canard wings up front, and a tail that looked like it had been glued on at the last minute. Its odd layout quickly earned it the nickname Ass-Ender, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how pilots felt. On paper, the design promised cutting-edge performance. In reality, it was unstable, unpredictable, and about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Takeoffs were especially dicey, as the aircraft often nosedived straight into the ground before it could even climb. One prototype literally flipped over mid-flight and plummeted to Earth, terminating its test pilot. Engineers tried to fix its quirks, but nothing could make this backwards bird behave. The Ascender never made it past the testing phase, canceled in 1944 after only a handful were built. Given what we know about it and looking at the design, it's incredible to think that they even built more than one. And there we have it, 10 aircraft that should never have made it off the sketch pad, let alone the runway. From nuclear bombers that terrified their own crews to pancake-shaped fighters and flying barrels that looked like plumbing experiments, each one proves that ambition and reality don't always meet at cruising altitude. For every Spitfire or Concorde, aviation history is littered with these bizarre, dangerous, or downright laughable missteps. But that's half the fun, isn't it? Human beings keep pushing the limits, even if it means occasionally inventing airborne disasters that barely deserve the name plane. If you enjoyed this trip through the worst wings in history, hit like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Tenfold Gold for more incredible stories from the strangest corners of our past. And let us know in the comments, which one of these disasters would you least want to fly in?